We're back for week 4, so by this time you have made it through the chapters on communication, motivating personnel, job design, leadership, management, those kinds of things. As you know, as I said earlier, we skipped week 3, which was fine, but hopefully what you are getting by this point is that each of the chapters builds on each other. Certainly if you can't have effective communication, it is going to impact the morale of your employees and whether or not they're motivated. And one has to look very carefully at leadership, who's running the show when it is looking at issues related to, say, communication and motivation. But one of the other things that leaders have to focus on, and is very significant to the, I would call it, healthy functioning of an organization, are things like occupational socialization. This is a huge issue in all organizations, certainly, but primarily in criminal justice organizations. What is occupational socialization? Well, it is the adopting of attitudes or orientations of the organization in which you work. And again, by way of example, I'm sure you all can recount, whether you work in CJ or not at this point, the time when you first came on the job to whatever job you have and how enthusiastic you were and how you were going to change the world and how it was the best place to work. And so you've now been there a while, and your feelings, my guess is, are very, very different about where you work now than when it was when you went initially to work there. But the act of actually adopting the attitudes or orientations of the people that work there or of the organization itself is a function of occupational socialization. The more you do that, the more you are at risk for having or engaging in poor or incomplete communication, and then, of course, lacking in motivation. Because what we find over time, what the research finds over time, is that generally people tend to feel jaded or cynical about where they work. So the longer you spend at a place, the more you know about how it works, the more you know, the less you want to know, the more cynical you become. And the more you adopt those attitudes about say it's probation. Well, you come in wanting to change the world and change probationers, and by the time you leave, you couldn't care less, and they're all the same. All they want to do is get one over on the system. Well, if those are the kinds of attitudes you're adopting, then you've succumbed to occupational socialization. It's a continuous process. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens over time, and it happens to everybody. The issue is what you, as the individual who are being subjected to it, what you do about it, especially if it's negative, because occupational socialization can be a good thing as well, although I think we generally tend to associate it with bad. But it happens all the time. It happens over time, and it is what you do with it, how you internalize it, that is going to make all the difference in the world. What can influence a positive occupational socialization, quite frankly, is training. Not only training within your own organization, but training with other organizations to understand the larger picture, the bigger picture about where you and whatever it is you do or your organization does fits into the larger spectrum. It's also influenced by communication. Again, going back to earlier chapters, the better your organization or the people in your organization communicate, the better it will be for you in terms of understanding what it is you do, how the organization operates, and it will impact that level of socialization. So occupational socialization, it's constant and it's consistent. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It does mean that you can mitigate it, and that's usually with training and communication. Something else I want to say about socialization. It occurs in formal and informal ways, and as I said before, it's a process. Anticipatory socialization is the attempt to recruit people who fit. If you're smart, if you're the HR director of your particular organization, you don't want to hire somebody for your organization that doesn't fit. Okay, so when you go through those hiring processes, that's why we have all the assessments and the application process and the interview process. The idea is to figure out whether there's a good fit between the person who's interviewing for the job and the organization as a whole. So that's anticipatory socialization. Formal socialization usually happens through formalized training. Most of you, whether you're police officers, probation officers, parole officers, or some mechanism thereof, you all went through some official training process to essentially become certified in the job that you do. That formalized training often sets up the foundation for any future socialization that you will undergo. And then, of course, informal socialization. That's the routine of the job, and it shapes the role of the employee. If you feel like all you're doing is pushing papers from one side of the desk to the other, then no doubt your attitude about your job and about the people you serve is going to be reflected in that. If you feel like you're making a difference and the work that you do changes the lives of others, then no doubt that will absolutely impact not only yourself, not only the others that work with you, but also the clients you serve. Let's switch gears just a tad now to talk about organizational culture, because of course the culture of an organization is in part driven by or impacted by how people are socialized to the organization in which they work. Organizational culture is a set of assumptions, values, and beliefs that are shared by the people who work in the organization. So if you work with other police officers, or you work with other probation or parole officers, or correctional officers, or other folks and other ancillary or tangentially related disciplines or organizations, whatever sort of overriding or common goals or values that you have are really what forms the organizational culture of where you work. Sometimes this involves creating a language or a lingo that is perpetuated. If you work in probation or you work in parole, you know there's a certain lingo, a certain language that you use. Policing, obviously, certain lingo that's used. Usually it's a private lingo in the sense that, it's a language that is often used by the officers to communicate with one another. It may be something that's also somewhat understood by people on the outside, but by and large, that language, it's a private or more private situation. Of course, organizational culture is impacted by norms, folkways, mores, and laws. Of course, the norms specify what we should and shouldn't do. Those are the laws that govern us. But they are also the laws, if you will, of the organization where you work. What you should and shouldn't do, isn't that in your employee manual? Okay, those tell you all the things you should and shouldn't do. Folkways. Those are the standard ways of doing things. Think of it this way. The norms are when you go to the police academy and what you're taught. The folkways are what you're taught when you are riding around with your field training officer for that initial period of time, right? Those are the ways things are really done. Ever heard from a police officer or other person who's been through some major training that they'll tell you, well, this is what the book says, and then this is what we do. Okay, so the norms, the difference between norm and folkways is generally that. Mores are strong views of right and wrong. Every organization feels very strongly about certain things and feels that there are certain rules that should be followed, should or should not be followed. So those things impact significantly the organizational culture of the place where you work and the socialization that you receive, good or bad. And of course, one cannot talk about socialization or culture without really talking about power and authority. And they are two very different, but somewhat similar. Can you be very different and very similar at the same time? I don't know, but I'm going to say that you can be. Power and authority are related. Power is getting somebody to do something they would not ordinarily do. It's really quite that simple. If I'm your probation officer, I have the power to tell you that you have to get a job. Now, that might not be something that somebody doesn't ordinarily want to do, but you have the power to make them do it. Now, whether they can actually get one is a different story, but you have the power to tell them that they have to do it. Okay, that's power. Authority is a little bit different. Authority it can be described as traditional, charismatic, or legal. Traditional authority is vested in the position a person holds. If I'm a senior administrator, if I'm a director or deputy director of a probation department, by virtue of the fact that that's my title brings with it certain authority to do X or to do Y. Charismatic authority. That is authority that is not driven by position, but is driven by personality and the ability of some people to get other people to do things, okay, that they may not want to do. And then, of course, there's always legal authority, and that's what we always have, right, in the criminal justice system. That is our our ultimate leverage is the legal authority. Well, the law tells us that this is what you must do, or this is what you must not do. So power and authority are critical to understanding culture and socialization, and the way that we communicate with each other and motivate our personnel to get the job done is often driven by power, or the blend between power and authority.